Welcome back. And we're moving into our first conversation for today with representatives of the United Nations country team as we find out more about their upcoming knowledge fair. We have in studio with us Karen Bernard, who is the Deputy Resident Representative for UNDP. And we have Tracey Hutchinson, who is the UN Coordination Analyst of the Office of the Resident Coordinator. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
And thank you for making the early journey from Belmopan as well. Now, before we move into the knowledge fair itself, let's just talk a bit about the work of the UN representatives in the country as it falls under the country team.
Right, well, I represent United Nations Development Program, and we work on human development issues. Mainly we work in the area of governance. So for example, we have a large project with the Ministry of the Attorney General and a lot of social partners on corruption. You'll be seeing a lot of that in the next few weeks. And we also work in the areas of biodiversity conservation and environmental protection. And we work, the third area that UNDP works on is addressing HIV and health challenges, particularly in terms of including groups of the population which tend to be more marginalized, and by that I mean maybe the LGBT population, also sex workers. Those are the main areas that UNDP works in. The United Nations as a whole, as you know, was established after World War II to promote peace and development. And we have a number of agencies that promote that from different perspectives. So what I just shared is from UNDP's role, how we try to do that in Belize.
Maybe I can add to share that in Belize we have approximately 18 UN agencies that have programs and projects in country. Several of them are resident, and then we have others that are non-resident but continue to have activities and interventions in country.
Now, what's interesting about the country team is that essentially, while you all have your own individual mandates, UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, you still work together to be able to deliver particular objectives. How do you decide with such specific mandates, whether UNDP, UNICEF working with kids, how do you decide together what will be the particular mission of the team?
That is done, Marlene, every cycle. The UN country team comes together with national authorities to determine what are those priority areas that collectively we ought to work on over a period of time. And in Belize, we have a new country program that commenced in 2017 that builds upon the Sustainable Development Goals. That is the broad agenda that we all have as an objective to work towards, and then looking at some specific areas that are fits within the priorities of the country, and in the case of Belize, that also complements what is the priority within the Caribbean region.
If I can speak to that question also, Marlene, in United Nations we are international civil servants, and that means we are here to serve the country that we're designated to work in. I'm now designated to Belize, so our role is to find out what are the priority issues for Belize that the government has identified and which the whole population is concerned about, and then we develop projects and we develop activities based on the priorities of the country. So in every country the program is a little bit different, depending on the development challenges, which are the real burning issues for Belize, as Belize defines it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think one of the very common perceptions people have when they hear a United Nations agency of any sort is that they feel that the agenda is fueled from outsiders. It's a foreign agenda that's being pushed. Talk a bit about, and that's essentially what you're saying, that it's really fed from government, or local government, and oftentimes when heads of state come together. How do you respond when people speak of this international agenda or foreign agenda being implemented?
Right, I think that's a misconception, because in fact United Nations is a member organization, and the members are the countries around the world, including Belize. So when you have the heads of state coming together, we have the General Assembly every year in New York. The heads of state from Belize also go there, and every country has one vote. So United Nations is a really remarkable way of all the countries in the world working together, but Belize is actually a member of United Nations. So Belize is not outside of the United Nations, and so I think that's a common misunderstanding. We're not something that comes from outside, we're something that Belize is actually part of, and Belize has signed on to, and Belize participates in just like every country around the world.
And you mentioned that you that in each country you identify priority areas. What are some of the priority areas here in Belize that have been identified?
Right. Well, it's not just that that we identify the priority areas, that we work with the government. In the case of UNDP, it's very important for us to have offices in the country. We've had an office here in Belize for more than 20 years, so that we can work closely over the years with the government and with the key partners. In Belize, the issues which have been identified as development challenges are, first of all, I mentioned the HIV positive population and the support that they need, particularly for the outreach to people who tend to be left behind, excluded, perhaps sometimes mistreated. We have LGBT population, sex workers, a number of groups, so that's one priority that was identified, and we're working with the Ministry of Health on that one. Then we also have, as I mentioned, the issue of corruption, which is a global concern, but as you might know, the country signed the UN Convention last year, so we were requested to support them on implementation of that convention. Those are just two examples.
Okay.
Yeah, and in the context of the wider UN system, our new multi-country sustainable development framework looks at really 4 priority areas that the UN system collectively is working on, both in Belize and the wider English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. And those areas include health, it includes social protection, it includes safe and resilient communities, and it also includes looking at areas of social cohesion and inclusiveness across the different countries. And those priority areas were defined based on collective national consultations that took place across the different territories within the Caribbean.
Now, this brings us to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the purpose of having the knowledge fair is so that everybody in Belize can seek out this particular opportunity to have the best understanding that they can, ask questions about what the SDGs are. So let's have our own informal knowledge fair here and talk about what the Sustainable Development Goals, when people say SDGs, what they are. Let's start there.
Perhaps when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, we're in essence talking about 17 goals and 169 targets that collectively looks at what is the global agenda that has been agreed to by member states of the United Nations to work towards peace, prosperity, and inclusive growth and development for all people. That's in essence what the agenda represents.
Yeah. And they've been whittled down to 17 particular goals.
And how many targets?
169.
But it's important to know that any country should choose which particular goals and which particular targets it wants to focus on, and also to be ambitious. So not to choose those which it has already fulfilled, but to choose ones that it wants to aim for, to strive to meet those important goals. So we certainly wouldn't expect a small country like Belize to try to meet every target or to address every goal.
Yeah, but to work within the very same priority areas that you spoke about before. Now, in being able to understand the Sustainable Development Goals, it is really important that people understand the context of how it was formulated out of the Millennium Development Goals, where when that was launched, it seemed very ambitious. 15 years to do things like eradicate poverty, and several others that I can't remember at this point. But talk about what the success or failures of the MDGs taught us that have now been included in the formulation of the SDGs.
Right, well, as you pointed out, they were quite ambitious, but for example, with the MDGs, the issue of poverty, that was one of the main goals under the MDGs and also under the SDGs. Eliminate all forms of poverty everywhere. It's extremely ambitious, but it's also crucial for human development, for people to have a decent life, so it's an extremely important goal. Now, with the Millennium Development Goals, we found that the numbers of people living in poverty were reduced by, I believe, 88 million people globally, but that was largely accomplished by rapid economic growth in China and India, which are countries that have a very large population. So this also reveals one of the main limitations of the MDGs was that it looked at averages. So large countries and averages could distort the reality that in many countries, poverty had not been reduced. And also that in many countries you have pockets of, even in wealthy countries, even in my country, which is Canada, that you have a certain group of people who are living in poverty. So as a result of that analysis and how we had somehow failed to really serve the population well, that the progress was uneven. With the Sustainable Development Goals, those are framed in such a way that there's a lot of targets, but you have to choose the target. But the overarching approach is to leave no one behind. And in fact, in UNDP, we say to reach the furthest behind first. And so that means that in a country where you work, so for example, Belize, we have to know where are the people living in poverty. We can look at Southside Belize City, we can look at Toledo, we know where they are, so we have to make an extra effort to reach out to them, to have the specific measures under the target, such as social protection systems with the social protection floor for those people who are being left behind.
Now, that's one example, and we know a very important cross-cutting issue in the Sustainable Development Goals is climate change. Let's talk about that for a second, why this has become such a predominant feature in the development goals set globally.
One of the reasons behind what is referred to as the green agenda, being the goals that specifically address the planet, if we look at them collectively, is because that was identified as one of those areas that in the MDGs, when they were identified, did not sufficiently address how development must take account of the environmental dimensions across different countries at different stages of development. And so we see that that is a significant part of the SDGs and also an important aspect, especially for countries like Belize, where our environment is an important part of our development.
In terms of climate change, I would say that Belize is doing extremely well on that particular goal. Belize is doing more than its share of work, but as you said, climate change is a troubling issue and it's dangerous for the entire world. We all live on the same planet, and climate change is not something that limits itself to a particular territory. Climate change is very complex. There are feedback loops. There are processes which initiate, such as melting of glaciers, which cannot be reversed. So once a glacier has melted, or once a country has desertified, or land that was previously was able to grow plants, then turns into desert, those are not reversible. So climate change is extremely dangerous, and it's a global process. So therefore, it really requires all of the countries working together. Belize is showing leadership in that area, and Belize is doing a tremendous amount to fight climate change, to preserve biodiversity, to set an example for the world. But unfortunately, Belize is caught up in all of these global processes, which are truly global and are very scientifically complex. Ocean currents that have, circulate globally, and all of these factors that the average person can't even understand. And the greenhouse gas emissions, it's very complex, but we're all in the same planet, so we need to save this planet.
But when we talk about major storms or heat waves or droughts, then it becomes more of it hits home, and people can be able to kind of make the connections. And that really is my next question. When we talk about development goals, it really seems, or it feels oftentimes, a bit highbrow, and the most important thing is that Jane and Joe Public, or whoever Belizean citizen in any part of this country, understands what the SDGs mean for them. How do we break down these complex goals for an individual to understand that this is a good thing and that it is working for a better life for them?
Well, absolutely, and I think that's where the knowledge fair comes in.
Absolutely right. The knowledge fair is a way of us being able to make available information on the 17 goals, on these targets, and how as individual citizens we are able to take action to contribute towards the achievement of these targets that are set. Several of the goals, for example, Goal 11, that speaks to sustainable consumption, is a very good example of how individuals can determine their own action in how we choose to consume biodegradable products, or we choose to ensure that in our specific communities we are able to take action to contribute to the space that we coexist in. And so there are specific actions that are possible for individuals, for companies, for government, for civil society, it is not just an agenda that is for the UN. It is really an agenda for the people, and it is an agenda that, once achieved, will ensure that there's a better life and opportunities for individuals across the world.
Okay, so, and you said once achieved. So how do you ensure then that these are realized, these goals are realized?
That's an excellent question, and I think that we have to see the targets because they're very specific and they give you a specific date. So, for example, in relation to what Tracey was commenting about responsible consumption, I'm looking at one of these goals, which is SDG 14, life below water. This is a goal in which, again, Belize performs very well. One of the targets is, by 2025, prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds, in particular from land-based activity, including marine debris and nutrient pollution. So that's a very specific target for 2025. And we can see that in Belize, there are things that all of us can do. When you're out in a boat, when you're down in Kikok or San Pedro or any of the lovely beach or seaside areas in Belize, you can do your part in terms of not creating debris for the ocean. You can do your part in terms of also raising awareness with other people about that. So that's just one small example. So what I like about the SDGs is that you do have very specific targets that people can get behind and can really work towards.
So it's not just, because sometimes we look at these things and we just assume that it's your responsibility to see that, to see these be successful, you know, but then you realize that as citizens, we also have some part to play in the success of the SDGs. And what I was interested in is, how is it implemented then? So before it's successful, then how do you go about in implementing these? Who do you get on board besides the citizenry?
Well, it's mainly the government of a country, because the government has been chosen by its citizens to represent them. So United Nations, we generally work with the government. And by extension, we understand that we're supporting the people who have, have voted for that government. There's a number of different targets. So I think, first of all, a country has to, choose its targets, choose its goals. There's a whole reporting process which United Nations can help with. That's part of what we're here for. And we also raise resources so certain activities can be undertaken. So there's a lot of ways that, at some level the citizens come in and there are actions they can take. Other levels are a bit more difficult because they depend on policymakers. I'll give you one example. To address poverty, in Belize we have a program called the Boost, which is a conditional cash transfer program for the poorest families, under which, and I believe it's called Building Opportunities for Social Transformation. That's the program. That's been implemented in a certain part of Belize City, I believe. And it involves, for example, giving parents whose children attend school, whose children get their vaccinations, giving them a cash supplement to cover their costs. So it's a very specific program. These programs have been shown to be very effective in other countries such as Chile, Mexico, Brazil, in lifting significant portions of the population out of poverty. But this is something that the policymakers and the government specialists need to work on, because in Belize, the situation that we have now is this excellent program, which has been evaluated as highly effective, but which covers a small portion of the people who would really need that program. So it needs to be expanded. This is also what we refer to as social protection. So that's an instance in which those type of activities require government specialists to work on, whereas marine pollution is something that every citizen can be involved in.
So it just depends on the goal.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about how the targets are funded, the work that is hoped to be achieved. While it is a government-led initiative, and I imagine some government resources will be invested, how does the UN help to source funding for the different projects?
Well, this is a good question. If you don't mind, I'll take the question.
Yes. One of the 17 goals, Goal 17, speaks to the means of implementation and the importance of having a global partnership to support sustainable development. And that is an area where, as the United Nations system, we are able to provide a space to bring together different actors who have a common purpose and are committed to the objectives of the SDGs to be able to support member countries, governments, civil society organizations, private sector entities towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And that also requires new ways of looking at financing, and financing for development ought to be targeted towards the goals that have already been agreed to. So there are various opportunities at looking at innovative ways of funding some of the initiatives that would contribute towards the achievement of the different targets.
Now, I can give you a specific example related to Belize. Yeah. Under the SDG on climate action, the target refers to the Green Climate Fund, which is a massive new fund that was created by all the countries to support actions on climate change, by which a country like Belize can access a multi-million amount of funding. So the specific goal says that the Green Climate Fund is to jointly mobilize around the world $100 billion US and to fully operationalize the Green Climate Fund through its capitalization. In Belize, we had an official request from government, from the Ministry of Economic Development, to support them on developing a proposal for Green Climate Fund. We had a team of experts that came into the country to work on the technical details, and we're developing a proposal for approximately $17 million for Belize. So we're currently negotiating that with the government and hope to secure that funding as soon as possible. We would love to secure more, and in fact, Belize can secure more funds under Green Climate Fund. And they're working not just with UNDP, they're working with the 5 Cs, working with PACT. PACT can also bring in money from Green Climate Fund. And those funds are urgently needed, so that's one specific way in which UN is supporting Belize, and other entities are also supporting Belize.
Now, we've also seen where accessing funds as a region is also one of the options that people are looking at. So instead of Belize being the sole country requesting funds for a particular area, you join up with CARICOM or the rest of the Caribbean or other Central American countries and perhaps try to access funds. Has that been an avenue explored so far?
Yes, it has been. There are a few instances where through various UN agencies, they would support multi-country programs that would have similar objectives, but would cover more than one country in terms of the areas of implementation. So there are some instances of that. I think we have a good example in UNDP with the Japan Climate Change Initiative that is being implemented across multiple territories within the Caribbean.
We also have an example in UNDP. It's called InfoSegura. This is a project for crime data management in which a number of Central American countries are involved, including Belize. Under that project, which relates to SDG number 16, which is on safety, safety of citizens, we've established the Belize Crime Observatory. We're establishing a sexual offenders registry. I don't know if you've seen the safety pin application where people can tag different locations and indicate their safety. That's an app on the mobile phone. So under that particular project, which is multi-country project involving El Salvador, Dominican Republic, I believe Guatemala, Honduras, and Belize, that's one example. So certainly Belize as a small country does tend to have
that's when we get to tap into or dual roots here, or Central American and Caribbean roots as well too.
No, exactly, yeah. And also the important thing about that type of project is that it allows you to learn from other countries what they've done, their innovations, their lessons learned, not to make the same mistakes that they made, something particularly interesting that they've done. We did see that in Dominican Republic, they had a crime observatory which is working very well, and that was part of the model that we used for the Belize Crime Observatory, which, as you know, is now up and running.
Now, looking at the goals as they are set out, and there's still people who may be a little bit skeptical about whether or not they will feel the impact. And I'll give an example. We know that the Millennium Development Goals had a focus on poverty. We know that this continues into the SDGs as well. In Belize, we hear so often about poverty alleviation projects, but yet we still have quite a significant poverty rate in the country. So if someone is watching at home and saying, yeah, we talk about this in the millions of dollars, but you know what, I'm still struggling in my everyday life. I'm still not able, either I'm struggling to survive as I am, or perhaps I'm already a bit behind with what my obligations are. How do you communicate to them that this Agenda 2030 is meant to be able to change the reality that they face today?
Well, I understand that people living in poverty, and there's a substantial group of people still in Belize living in poverty and facing difficulties every day to put food on the table, how they would feel despair and frustration. I certainly do understand that. And so I would say that, you know, it's best if you try to get that across to your government. UNDP is here to support. But really, what the SDGs mean for all of us is that if you just stand by as an observer and you don't get involved, then it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, then you will not accomplish anything. But if you take that, you know, risk and that you do get involved in whatever way you can, if you become part of the solution, then you will get closer to the solution. In United Nations, we believe in being optimistic against all odds, and we would ask people to join us in this effort.
Absolutely. And I think the universality of the agenda also provides space for addressing issues such as ensuring that people and citizens have access to decent employment. Because what we have come to learn is that in order for certain goals to be achieved, such as no poverty, there is the need to ensure that there are other enabling factors and that are in place. And we see clearly that the need for access to education and access to health care is important, and quality of those services become important. And so one of the main differences in this new agenda is that if you were to look at the targets provide for action that takes place at community level, at the local level, at various levels of government. And so that is where it provides a space for citizens to be able to have a voice and to say that they will contribute to the solution, and they are part of that process of ensuring that there's a continuous effort towards implementation.
Let's talk about short-term reality. So your targets, as you pointed out, some of them they do have a timeline. And what we've done is taken these 17 goals and broken them down into the 169 targets, which, depending on where you are as a country, it's not that we'll attempt to achieve 169, but what fits best for us, right?
Absolutely.
Now, let's look at some of the short-term goals that Belize will be attempting through the implementation of the SDGs.
I would say it's not so much short-term goals, but it's progress towards the targets.
Yeah.
So by having targets which have been agreed by all the countries in the world, and as Tracey said, these are universal, these targets are very relevant. So it's not so much that you have additional goals short-term, but you would say after 5 years, the country would report on what is our progress towards reaching a specific target. So I think that's probably the most practical way to look at that.
Yeah. And the reporting process is every 5 years?
I'm not entirely sure, Tracey, do you know?
Well, the reporting is done, there's an annual reporting that is done on the SDGs through what is called a high-level political forum, where all members of the United Nations will come together, and certain countries, in the case of Belize, was among one of those first set of countries that chose to submit an annual report earlier this year to be able to represent what the government of Belize has done so far in adapting this new agenda and the efforts that they have made towards implementation.
Now, I should mention that Belize is actually quite advanced in this regard, because Belize, when it developed its new development strategy, the Growth and Sustainable Development Strategy, the country integrated the Sustainable Development Goals into that, so it's aligned. So Belize, when it reports on its own development strategy, will at the same time be reporting on the SDGs, so it's all integrated.
Yeah.
The good thing is that it's not just an additional report, but it's just part of the same report, so that makes it more manageable.
And it makes more sense if you kind of align the goals that you're working towards. Now, one of the interesting things I always find is that when you talk about these types of commitments made by a country, by our country, they're not always binding, you know? A lot of times the conventions that we've signed on to, they look fantastic on paper, but the implementation is not something that you are legally bound to, and the SDGs is very similar. But there is a bit of goodwill that comes along with it, and faith that you do want better for your society. Let's talk about how the UN works to be able to support and continue to advocate for work towards the SDGs, especially given the fact that it's a non-binding agreement.
Well, as you say, this is a good point that many of the conventions that a country signs onto are not necessarily binding. So it's really up to the country to be honorable and to have the leadership to meet those obligations that come under these conventions. This is not a convention, it's goals that were agreed on in a voluntary way, that also there was a lot of consultation globally to decide what the goals and targets should be. So it's a question of I feel quite confident that Belize will be stepping forward and will be trying to meet these goals. But in these matters, it's also important that the population be involved and support their government in that as well. So if we all work together, there's no obligation per se. So you can take the position that, I have no interest in alleviating poverty in your country, but I think that most people will say that it's better for all of us. It's better for the world we live in, and even if we're not directly the person affected, to come together and work towards these common goals, which no one can argue with the goals because these goals have been agreed on by all the countries around the world as the common factors that all countries are struggling with. So I do believe that we have enough goodwill and we have enough commitment. And I certainly have seen in the case of Belize that we have so many talented, competent, well-educated people that I personally believe that Belize as a country can accomplish anything it sets its sights on. I have seen that. So it's a matter of just coming together and working for the common good in this case.
And so the knowledge fair then is to garner that support then. So
From the wider public.
From the wider public. So what can we expect at the knowledge fair?
The Knowledge Fair will be a space where we have different organizations, UN organizations, government, civil society, perhaps some private sector entities that would have on display what they're doing. It's a way of individual entities showcasing their work and how their work contribute to specific SDGs in Belize. And so it's a space that allows for them to share that information, for them to network among themselves, and also to be able to raise awareness around the work that they're doing. What are some further opportunities for advancing around specific SDGs?
And who's the specific target audience? Who are you aiming this information to?
We're looking at making it accessible to the general public. So
Okay.
it's an open public event and no cost event.
Okay.
It's open to students from secondary schools, from tertiary level institutions, from the universities and sixth forms to be able to come out and learn a bit more about what this agenda means and what it should mean for Belizeans.
And it's going to be held tomorrow?
No,
Thursday, sorry.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's being held on Thursday, the 23rd, at the Civic Center in Belmopan. It's starting at 9 a.m. in the morning, and we run through until 4 p.m. in the afternoon.
Full day.
Okay. And what would be your hope in terms of the takeaway of a tertiary level student going into the knowledge fair who knew very little or understood very little about the SDGs?
Well, I would say that for a student, SDGs are an opportunity that they can seize, and they can say, if I want to have an impact on my country and, do something to make the world a better place, this is an opportunity. So any student can see in terms of their particular skills or their particular interests where they can fit in.
Yeah, definitely. It's creating, the future that they will be a part of as adults as well. So the event will be in Belmopan on Thursday at the Civic Center, open to the public, so you can stop in if you're in that area. Anything else you'd like to tell people about coming out and being a part of the knowledge fair so that they can ask their own questions about the SDGs?
I would like to share that we still have a few more exhibit booths.
Okay.
So if there are any organization that's out there that is interested in wanting to showcase their work, they're welcome to contact our office and to be able to be a part of this event. For those individuals who are interested in learning a bit more about the agenda, it's an opportunity to increase their own knowledge and awareness, because action starts first with awareness, and we feel that if people are more knowledgeable and aware of what this agenda means and what it means for them, then they're in a better place to be able to have a voice and to contribute to the actions that are required.
All right. Well, thank you both for coming in and giving us a glimpse as to the type of information people can access at the Knowledge Fair, and reminding everybody that it is a public event. You can head out and be able to find out for yourself what the SDGs mean for you. That takes place on Thursday in Belmopan. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having us on the show.
Thank you for having us.
We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by representatives of the Belmopan Active Youth to find out about their upcoming arts festival. So stay tuned.